This is Just Something About Her, a podcast from the Recount and iHeartRadio.
This is a guy sitting in another state who is essentially in your daughter's bedroom and dictating to her what she can and cannot do with her body.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Palmieri, and this is Just Something About Her, a podcast from the Recount. On this show, we're getting to the bottom of what still holds women back from women who are beating the odds. This week's guests, Royce Brooks and Wendy Davis. Welcome to Just Something About Her.
Thank you.
Thanks. Happy to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
So I interviewed the state senator, Brian Hughes, who introduced in the Senate, Texas State Senate, both the abortion bill and the elections overhaul bill. He said he was a trial lawyer, and he said that's how he knew how to construct this bill, right? To have these bounties, to have it enforced by people ratting on their neighbors. He says that's why he did it. He says it's not about trying to get around Roe v. Wade. But Wendy, can you tell us what is actually happening here with this bill? This is something you have a lot of experience in dealing with Texas state legislators and abortion.
Well, first of all, I don't know anyone who'd want to take credit for this diabolically evil bill, but it's fascinating that Brian Hughes is claiming to have come up with this litigation strategy when actually we all know it was another individual who had been testing this theory at the local level in many different communities around the state. And having had success in shutting a Planned Parenthood clinic down in Lubbock, they decided to try this at the statewide level. And you're exactly right, Jennifer. This was done specifically to get around Roe. And the way that it was designed sought to deny any state involvement whatsoever, any state action, because where other states have tried this and implemented 6-week bans, immediately their circuit court or the Supreme Court have issued injunctions because it is patently against the constitutional precedent that a state would interfere with that constitutional right. Here, they put it in the hands of individuals, these vigilantes, and to show you how absolutely absurd the bill is, a debarred lawyer in Arkansas and a disbarred lawyer in Illinois were the two first plaintiffs to sue under it. And if you think about it this way, how creepy this is, right? This is a guy sitting in another state who is essentially in your daughter's bedroom, right? I mean, that's essentially what this boils down to, and dictating to her what she can and cannot do with her body. And I think everyone finds that repulsive, and it's fascinating to me that even in Florida, they're shying away from taking such an extreme approach because I think they understand that ultimately this backfires. But the fascinating thing in Texas politics is they can't get far enough right of each other, right? They've decided that the general elections don't matter. The only thing they need to care about is whether they're going to get run at from the right in a primary. And they crawl so far to the right on top of each other and over each other. It's fascinating and disgusting all at the same time. Because right now, a very small percentage of our registered voters in Texas actually voted to put Greg Abbott in office and Ken Paxton in office. In fact, I think it's somewhere around 9% of registered voters voted in that Republican primary that made them the candidate in the last election cycle. And now the 70+% of Texans who disagree with what they're doing are stuck with their terrible, terrible quote unquote leadership.
Wendy, how does this compare to the legislation that you filibustered so famously in 2013?
Members, I'm rising on the floor today to humbly give voice to thousands of Texans who have been ignored.
Well, back then what we were fighting was a different strategy of the anti-abortion movement. It involved the targeted regulation of abortion providers, putting unique and onerous regulations on abortion facilities so that they would be forced to close, requiring that the doctors who perform abortions at abortion facilities have admitting privileges at a hospital within 30 miles. And what it immediately did was that it closed more than half of our clinics. We had 42 clinics when that law went into effect and only 20 afterward. And now, of course, that dynamic exists all over the state with the shuttering of most of our clinics as a consequence of SB 8. And I want to make sure that your listeners know we have created a fund specifically to indemnify these frontline abortion care providers so that if and when they are sued, they will have the resources they need to pay any fines or opposing counsel fees that they might incur if they're found liable. It's called fundthefrontlinetx.org is our website, and there's a donate button on there.
I think it's important. I did not appreciate until I was in Texas this week, the ratcheting up of the abortion laws and how, this is the most recent law. It's the most drastic, but yeah, they've been making it harder and harder. So Royce, have you seen, and this is true for abortion rights, it's true for voting rights, it's this like winnowing away, just trying to erode them bit by bit? Like, what does it feel like is happening with these legislators in Texas?
Absolutely. This feels sudden for some people, the enactment of SB 8, but it's part of a years-long strategic process. The idea of not just simply regulating abortion providers out of existence, but going so far as to ban abortion is something that we've been seeing in cities in Texas for some time now. They then decided to attempt it statewide. Frankly, I don't think that they actually expected to have that ban enacted.
I wonder about that.
I think that they have surprised themselves with that and are wondering among themselves whether they have overstepped.
I have heard some chatter about that in this town here, and picking up Austin chatter, that either some members are claiming, I didn't know this was how drastic it was. They didn't realize what they were voting for, or they certainly didn't think it was going to take effect as quickly as it did. They thought this case was going to the Supreme Court. They did not think that it would be enacted, and that they would be dealing with it in September and October of 2021.
Well, they certainly knew what they were voting for, and this is what they have been.
Interesting that they don't want you to think that, though. That seems like some sort of victory, Royce, for your team making sure people understand what's happening here.
That's exactly it, and I think it goes to Wendy's point, right? That these drastic laws, these bans, are unpopular with most Texans, and that this is all part of a strategy to appeal to an increasingly narrow sort of right-wing primary base, and has nothing to do with meeting the needs or the desires of the average Texan. The voter suppression work in particular feels like a very direct backlash to the success that real Texans, real Texas communities have had in building power over the last several years, and the steady increases that we've seen in women's representation, in young people's representation, in the power of communities of color. And that goes hand in hand with an ongoing redistricting process that is
that's happening right now.
It's happening
the Texas legislature,
as we speak. That is very deliberately suppressing and curtailing the power of communities of color, despite the fact that 95% of the population growth that Texas saw over the past decade is people of color. Somehow the legislature has managed to propose a congressional map wherein people of color have a smaller proportion of representation, smaller opportunity to elect candidates of choice than in the previous map. It's blatant. And it is all about who gets to hold and exercise power in this state.
If we can't control our reproductive destiny, not only does that hurt us individually and hurt the children that we already have, it also hurts the workforce and therefore the overall economy.
People first heard your name, Wendy, from when you were a member of the Texas State Senate. You filibustered for 13 hours in 2013 in your pink sneakers. When you look back on that moment, did you think that we were on this trajectory?
I mean, at the time, we still had Justice Kennedy on the Supreme Court, and we held out hope that we would be able to articulate a position that would bring him our way. And now, of course, the court is completely different. And so could I have seen at that point in time how bad things would get? Absolutely not. And I'll tell you, even as of September the 1st, I thought we were going to wake up that day and the Supreme Court was going to enjoin the enforcement of that law. And it is just astounding and shocking and incredibly disappointing that they did not enjoin its enforcement when it's so patently clear that it was designed specifically to get around a test of its constitutionality, and they went there and they allowed that excuse to be their excuse for not enjoining it. And right now, regardless of what the Supreme Court does, Roe v. Wade is the law of the land until they decide, and they potentially will when they take up the Mississippi case in December. It's still the law of the land. And so to allow a situation where abortion was completely curtailed in the state of Texas while Roe still stands is just absolutely not in keeping with their duty as Supreme Court justices and demonstrates how tremendously political this court has become thanks to the 3 appointees that Donald Trump was able to make.
Did you find that, Royce, that has been a galvanizing moment? Do you feel like there is, I know you had women's marches last week, that there's a big response to it. It does seem that there is within the country.
We have very much seen people here in Texas paying attention to this, being galvanized by this, being outraged, as well they should. And, we do have elections coming up. In fact, a very big set of elections. Every legislative seat in the state will be on the ballot next year. Every member of the U.S. House will be on the ballot, of course. All of our statewide offices will be on the ballot, including Greg Abbott and indicted Attorney General Ken Paxton. And I think that people will absolutely remember not just this, but the attempts to strip away their voting rights. The absolute failure of our state's leaders to do anything about the horrific and deadly utility failures that we saw earlier in the year. It's time for change, and if this is the level of awfulness that we have to sink to get people to pay attention, then that's kind of where we are.
Wendy, you grew up in Texas, right?
I did.
So you have lived this, because my understanding is that you were 10 when the Roe v. Wade case was settled.
That's right.
Then stood on the Texas Senate floor to fight to protect these rights. Do you have any memory of that?
I don't, but I had the benefit, as did Royce, of growing up in a Texas where this was something that was provided as part of our reproductive autonomy and access, of course, to contraceptive care and our ability to control our economic destiny because we could control our reproductive autonomy. And for me, Jennifer, I'm such a living example of that. I was 18 when I found out that I was pregnant. I had my daughter Amber when I was 19 years old. I became a single mom. I was living in poverty. I was working 2 jobs and trying to figure out how in the world I was going to scramble out of it. And if it hadn't been for a Planned Parenthood clinic that provided me with the contraceptive care that I needed, if I'd had a second unplanned pregnancy, I am absolutely sure that I wouldn't have been able to make my climb out of that. And that's what this is all about. This isn't about abortion per se. This is about a much bigger issue. And it's whether we as individuals, whether women or our trans or non-binary community who seek abortion care, if we can't control our reproductive destiny, not only does that hurt us individually and hurt the children that we already have, it also hurts the workforce and therefore the overall economy. And we've certainly seen with COVID and the dramatic curtailment of women in the workforce as a consequence of the challenge of finding affordable quality childcare, which is a whole nother podcast topic. We've seen what happens when women are pushed out of the workforce. This bill is going to do the very same thing. This law will do the very same thing if it is allowed to stand. And it's such a tragedy at the individual level, but it's such a tragedy for us as a state and as a country as well.
Royce, I want you to tell us that because just to remind listeners about this voting rights bill, because there's so much that's happened in Texas and we've been focused on abortion for the last month. If you have a couple of examples so that people understand why this bill is particularly problematic for women, for people of color.
Absolutely. So again, this voter suppression legislation that we've seen this year is a direct response and a direct backlash to the gains in power that we've seen communities of color in particular. This all really came to a head in the 2020 elections and with COVID, because of the need to have some safety protections and think about how people could vote safely and conveniently during a deadly pandemic. We saw cities and counties across Texas taking some creative measures to do that. The core of this legislation is the ability for partisan individuals to have access to voting locations and to, in effect, be put into the position to intimidate voters. And by the way, this is a thing that already happens in Texas. We have seen groups of white supremacists, armed folks outside of voting locations in communities of color. That's now something that is being officially sanctioned by the state, and it's disgusting.
For the excitement of an election where money is being spent, where voters are being registered, where turnout is increasing, they want that to go away.
To demonstrate, this is an adjacent issue, redistricting, but just for people to have an example of how it plays out, and we'll use Wendy's district as an example. So this is a district that you represented from 2009 to 2015, Senate District 10 in Tarrant County, is that right?
That's right.
Okay, so District 10 has an eligible voter population that's 54% white, 20% Hispanic, 21% Black, and 3% Asian. Non-white voters have been on the rise and electing more diverse candidates for the last decade. But the new proposed Senate map, the new redistricting, splits up the district and paired it with counties to the south and west that make the district more white, more rural, and much more likely to vote Republican. So under the proposed changes, the district's voting age population would be 62% white, 17% Hispanic, 17% Black, 2% Asian. What does that mean for your constituents, particularly people of color? What's the impact?
It's a tremendous impact on the communities of color in Tarrant County, tremendously negative one. And in 2011, during the last round of redistricting, the legislature did tear the district apart. They separated the Hispanic voters from the Black voters to neuter their voices, and they put each of those communities into dramatically Republican areas that were literally, in some instances, more than 100 miles away from where they lived and had no common interest with. But we had Section 5 still protecting us, that pre-clearance portion of the Voting Rights Act. We did sue. We were in court for somewhere around a year, and we got the district put back together. Now here we are with a Supreme Court that has decided that we don't need Section 5 anymore because, of course, racism is a thing of the past, and we have lost the ability to fight. And they've torn the district apart again. And, you know, it's about two things. It's not only about tearing away the ability for people in that community to elect a candidate of their choice in the immediate go-around. It's also the fact that when you have swing districts, which SD 10 is, they are competitive. And when they are competitive, that means that voters are staying engaged, that politicians are registering voters, turning out voters, and keeping the turnout high. And where turnout is high, it always favors Democrats in our state. And when you look at the way the maps are drawn right now, the proposed maps, the congressional map, the state house map, the state senate map, there is one thing that they all have in common. And that is that they have removed any swing districts so that there are now solidly red districts and solidly blue ones, of course more red than blue, but no swing seats remaining. And the reason for that is because they want throughout the state, for the excitement of an election where money is being spent, where voters are being registered, where turnout is increasing, they want that to go away. It is a part of the overall long-term voter suppression plan that they have in place. And unfortunately, it is likely to be very successful because, as you know from your political experience, Jennifer, when you're investing in voter turnout, you are creating a voter participation that otherwise would not exist.
Royce, you had a great quote where you said Republicans are falling all over themselves to be more extreme than each other. They were taking it on the women of Texas with a lot of these policies, and you added that these attacks are galvanizing women. So what is up with all the men running statewide, y'all? What is, I mean, like all these great white guys are rising up to take this on. Wendy, you've done this once before. Do you think there's any chance that you will run?
This cycle, no, there's not. And I'm not ruling out the possibility that I might want to do that or hope to have the privilege of doing that in the future. And I am disappointed that at this point we only have white men on the Democratic statewide slate. I think we might see some changes in that. I think we might see a couple of women stepping forward.
You know, when y'all have to face if you feel optimistic about where the state can go and will go or not, where do you come down?
I feel hopeful about where Texas can go because I know what Texas is and who Texans are. They are not these cruel, mostly men, who are trying to maintain power at all costs and who are imposing this reprehensible legislation on the rest of us. You know, Texas is Barbara Jordan, right? Texas is Ann Richards. Texas is Beyonce. You know, like that is my Texas. And I know that we have it in us to manifest that Texas in our leadership.
Royce, Wendy, thank you both so much.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.